Do you ever feel like your fire's gone out? Like you're running on fumes, burnt out, unsure if you'll ever feel lit up by your work or your life again? Or maybe you've never even known what your fire is, or whether you have one. Well, spoiler alert, you do. And whether you've lost it or are looking for it for the first time ever, this episode will help you reignite that flame and find yourself. Welcome to Unleash Your Inner Creative with Lauren LaGrasso. I'm Lauren LaGrasso. I'm a Webby Award-winning podcast host and producer, singer-songwriter, public speaker, and creative coach. This show sits at the intersection of creativity, mental health, and spirituality, and it is meant to give you tools to love, trust, and know yourself enough to redefine your relationship with fear, claim your birthright to creativity, and go after whatever it is that's on your heart. Today's guest is the incredible Shannon Watts. Shannon is the founder and former leader of Moms Demand Action, one of the largest grassroots movements in the country dedicated to ending gun violence and creating safer communities. She's also a speaker, community leader, and author of the brand new book, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age. I wanted to have Shannon on the show because she is an icon and the epitome of using your creativity to change the world. And that includes her work since stepping down from Moms Demand Action. Her newest life mission is helping women find, ignite, and chase their fire. What lights them up, what makes them go, and really feeling into what your desires are and unabashedly going forth and pursuing them. To me, this is still activism, but in an unleash your inner creative kind of way. Because if everyone in the world was going after their deepest truth and passion from a pure place, like the purest part of their passion and the purest part of what makes them who they are, the world would be a much better and more beautiful place. In this conversation, we talk about how to find your fire, even if you feel like you've lost it. We explore what purpose really means, how to avoid the burnout trap, how to detach your worth from your work, and how to summon your audacity and release the fear of pissing people off or failing, especially if you spent your whole life avoiding getting in trouble and trying to be a quote-unquote good girl. This is a conversation for anyone who's questioned their path, felt their passion dim, or needed permission to start again. Okay, now here she is, Shannon Watts. Okay, Shannon Watts, I am so thrilled and honored to be here with you today on Unleash Your Inner Creative, and I'm so excited that you've written a book to help people do just that, to unleash their creativity in their lives. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
My honor. And because of my job, I read a lot of personal development books. And I have to say, yours is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, that I've read in the last year.
Oh my gosh. That
Yeah.
means so much to me.
It really is, because it's helpful. You bring in storytelling, there's inspiration, there's practical tools, and they all weave together. I feel like so often in these books, like there's one or not the other, or even if there are all of them, they're kind of not living in the same world. And you found a way to bring in other people's stories and your own stories and these practical tips and storytelling. It's amazing. So I'm really, really grateful for what you've done.
Thank you. You know, I read a lot of self-help books too. And what I find often is that there's this premise, but then it's like 300 pages of nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's why I wanted to interview over 70 women who were fire starters, right? It's this idea of women who, no matter what their age was, figured out how to come alive. And to me, the inspiration that they offer, it's like, if they can do it, so can I.
Right. And the other great thing about it is you interviewed people from all different professions and all different places in their lives, not just like age-wise, but like where they are in their career. So no matter who's reading, the reader is going to be able to relate to at least a handful of stories in there. And the other thing I noticed, which probably is something like only someone who reads self-development books like every month would notice, is a lot of times when people are interviewing other people, it feels like they're doing it because they're like, wait, I have proof over here. It's not just me. I can also share this proof. But it's so clear that you're a community builder from reading the book, because everything made sense and weaved together. And it was like, this is my experience. And then this is also this other person's experience, versus like giving your power away. It's subtle, but I really noticed that.
Thank you. And I think the other piece of it is I wanted to interview people who weren't all perfect and weren't on this hero's journey and it just worked out okay. I mean, I interviewed people who admitted some uncomfortable things about even still being stuck sometimes and patterns they fall into. And I don't want us all to pretend like figuring out what we want to do with our lives, personal, professional, political. It's not always a straight linear path.
Yeah, no, you had so many people who had over 200 rejection letters in there. I feel like I read that
Yes.
3 times. So yeah, so let's get to what we're talking about. You interviewed these people, you shared your own story of being a fire starter. So what does it mean to live on fire?
What I found in my own life, and I didn't really realize this until my late 30s, early 40s, and then I saw it play out over and over again, not just in my career, but in my activism, is that women are often taught to fulfill their obligations and men are taught to follow their desires.
Hmm.
And it is a totally different way of living. And it's just the way that society has created it. And so a few things happen. One is sometimes we start to believe that our obligations are our desires. That's a very easy trap to fall into. I, for example, thought busyness was my whole purpose in life for a decade. But also, it's a practice. It's a discipline. You don't just wake up and say, okay, well, that's it. I'm not going to follow my obligations anymore. I'm just living a life where I follow my desires. We have obligations, right?
Right.
But my premise is, what if women lived so that they were constantly asking themselves, what do I want? And we don't not live that way because we're weak. It's because we're wise. We see the way that society and the systems are set up. What would happen if women did pursue their desires? Well, institutions would topple, governments would fail, family systems would fall apart. We know what would happen. Society knows what would happen. And yet we still have to push anyway, because I have seen so many women either take huge leaps or little baby steps toward living the way they really wanted to live, a way that was authentic to them. And it was completely life changing in the best ways.
Yeah. So can you give an example? Like, what is fire and what
Mm.
is not fire?
So, living on fire is a metaphor. And I should say that I took a whole bunch of self help books that I love to a friend's house who's a pretty famous author. And she looked at them and she said, these are all very boring, and you are a fiery person.
Yeah.
And that was when I was like, oh, she's right. Like, this is the metaphor for how I feel and how I live and how I want all women to feel and live. And so living on fire is really living in a way that is constantly looking at two things. What are the things that are holding me back?
Hmm.
What are the things that are calling me? It's almost a constant audit, a curation of how am I spending my time? How am I allotting my priorities? How am I thinking every single day about what do I want? And so that is the metaphor of living on fire. It's basically coming alive. It's fire starters are women who decide that they are going to prioritize their desires over their obligations.
Yeah. And you spoke a little bit to it, but can you go over some of the consequences? Because one thing I really dislike is when somebody's like, "How did you follow your dreams?" They're like, "I just did it." It's like there's so much undoing and doing in order to just do it. And it really is an inside job, and it's a very holistic thing to go after what your fire is. So what are some of the real consequences that women face that stand between them and their desire?
So I'm glad you said that about, like, some people just say, like, go do it. There is, and I think this is a really positive, there are a lot of conversations right now in the zeitgeist about all of the amazing accomplishments of women, particularly in middle age, right? These are not things that my mother experienced when she was in middle age. We have, I think, I'm Gen X, but my generation and the generations coming up behind me, we have all these examples of what women are doing. Like, I just saw this woman breastfeed through an entire marathon and still win. Like,
Wow.
okay, that's amazing. But what I want to know, and this is why I wrote the book, was what is the how? How did women get to doing these things? And I talked to so many women and they said to me, I wish I had a handbook that would prepare me for all the different kinds of blowback that I will get when I live in a way that is authentic to me. And, I call a lot of these extinguishers in keeping with the fire metaphor. These are feelings that engender guilt and shame, right? That make you want to turn back and not keep moving forward. It's very easy, and I've seen it so many times where women have these brilliant ideas or these goals or these passions, and they just don't end up following through because they feel guilt or shame. And that results in the things we already all know, right? Imposter syndrome, perfectionism, a desire to disappear, all of these things that we have all experienced. And I talk to so many women who have either are in the middle, the messy middle, or have gone through the messy middle, and how they endured those feelings of blowback, how they got through them, how they got to the other side. I talked to this one woman, her name is Becca De Felice, and she started out as a Moms Demand Action volunteer, realized that she was really good at it, and unfortunately, when you spend a lot of time in state houses, you realize not all of these representatives are rocket scientists. And if you are kind and caring and compassionate, you could be doing that job.
Right.
And so a lot of them end up running for office. And Becca did. She ran for office twice in Texas. Not a lot of Asian American women who have been represented in the state legislature there. And she lost both times. And she said there was guilt on her part from, spending all this time on a race and being away from her family. There was shame because she lost, and she was sort of this living, breathing embodiment of what happens when a woman tries something and fails.
Yeah.
And, she thought about it and said, look, men fail all the time, and it doesn't hold them back. They don't feel the need to disappear. I would give examples of, Beto O'Rourke and Elon Musk. Like, they have failed many times, and yet they continue to ascend. They continue to be very public and in demand as personalities. And so she said, I'm not going to disappear. And she ended up taking the expertise she got from running for office. And now she's leading an organization in Texas that trains other women. And she can say, this was my experience. And this is what it'll feel like when you fail. And this way you have to keep trying and keep running.
So, yeah, those parts of the book really hit me because I have realized in my life how many times I've rebranded disappointment even as failure. Like, I felt so downtrodden over the fact that things didn't go the way I thought they should go in the very limited time frame I gave myself, that I was like, well, I failed and I should never try again. And I guess I have to give up that dream. What are from all the women you've spoken to and also from your own life, your top failure or disappointment resilience tips?
I learned two really important things from Moms Demand Action, because when you are in a nonprofit, a single issue organization, it isn't hard to get volunteers to come in when there's a horrific shooting tragedy or their kid goes through a lockdown drill, right? They want to get off the sidelines and do something. You know what is hard? Keeping volunteers engaged and staying in the organization, because they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart, right? They lead busy lives, and yet they keep showing up. We found we weren't really having a lot of retention issues. And so we thought, let's poll our volunteers and ask why they stay. And they said two things. And I think this information can be used in anyone's life, in anyone's career, in anyone's activism. Number one reason they stayed was because they felt they were winning. And I'll just be honest with you. When you take on the most wealthy, powerful special interest that's ever existed, you lose a lot. So it wasn't like we were always winning. There were plenty of losses. But what we realized was that we needed to reframe those losses. As you said, rebrand those losses as wins. It's called losing forward. So yeah, you lost a big legislative battle, but what did you actually win what did you learn so that you can win the next time? Maybe you grew your chapter. Maybe you have stronger relationships with representatives in your state legislature. There's all these different ways to look at a loss to figure out how you win the next time. And I think it's Babe Ruth who said, you can't beat the person who never gives up. And so it's this idea of keep going. That's the first thing I would say about resilience. The second thing I would say is that the second reason people gave us for staying was that they found their people. And when you find a group of like-minded individuals who share the same values, who see and recognize your abilities, who want to help you pursue your desires, and that is the formula for living on fire, those three things, then you want to keep showing up and you feel more resilient because you have support.
Oh, love it. Okay, I want to get into that. I think you were speaking to something you call bonfire friends. By the way, all of your fire metaphors were fire.
Thank you. Thank you.
They were so good. I didn't read any of them and be like, really, she's stretching it. I was like, wow. Like, because sometimes even with my podcast, I'm like, I just had to put creativity in the title. Like, I couldn't have done something more broad. but like you really made it all work. So I just got to give you that kudo.
Thank you.
Okay, so you spoke a little bit about the FIRE formula. The FIRE triangle is desire, values, and abilities. If someone's listening right now and they're like, I don't know what my FIRE is, I don't know how to find it. Can you talk a little bit about how this triangle can help somebody discover it?
Yeah. I hear all the time, I don't know what I want. Who am I to think about what I want? I don't have time to think about what I want. I'm too old
Mm-hmm.
to decide that now. And none of that is true, right? And so what I found is, and this happened for me when I was 41 years old. I had spent sort of a lifetime on autopilot, feeling very meh, definitely in my marriage, in my career. And it wasn't until I figured out that formula, which is marrying your values, your abilities, and your desires, that my life began to feel fulfilling and that I figured out what it was that I was good at and wanted to continue to do. And then I held the hands of thousands of other women who did the exact same thing. Whether it was a data entry lead who came into the organization and saw she was really good at leadership and organizing, and then she decided to run for office, and then she decided to start her own organization, right? So this fire formula, in order to live on fire, is a practice. It isn't something you just say, okay, these are my abilities, my values, and my desires, and here we go. There's so many exercises in the book that help you figure out what are your values right now. And there's, if you follow Brene Brown, there are hundreds and hundreds of values, and they change throughout your life. When I was the mom of young kids, my values were much different than they are now as an empty nester. That doesn't mean those values go away, but they ebb and flow. They take priority over others. So just even sitting down and categorizing, what are those, and keeping track of them? What are my abilities? I think often we lose sight of who we are and what we're good at. There's an exercise in the book where it's like, go ask other people how they see you and your abilities. Think about what you did as a kid that lit you up and just made you feel so great. And is that still something that you really care about and you're passionate about? So taking an inventory of all your skills and abilities, and maybe there are more that you need to go get. You can, some abilities you have are innate, some are acquired. And so thinking about where you are there, and then what are your desires? And as I said, there are false desires, busyness, happiness, purpose, all of these things that were sort of sold in a capitalistic society. And there are ways in the book to determine what are the things that society are telling me that are my desires, but what are my actual desires? What do I want to be and do? And this is a big word. I know it's loaded, but like, what do I want my legacy to be?
Mm. Well, what do you see legacy as?
Legacy is this huge word. And I think in my mind anyway, it's equated with men, like men who create foundations and men whose names are on hospitals.
Yeah.
And
I'm picturing a guy being like, my legacy.
yes, it's a huge, lofty idea. And when you ask people what they think their deathbed regret will be, and I asked women for this book, it was often that I spent too much time pursuing what I wanted at the expense of my children,
Mm.
or that I didn't live a life that was authentic to me. Like we have all these fears built up, and so we don't sort of live fully. And I decided I don't want any woman to get to the end of her life and feel like she didn't burn. I'm on the other side of that chasm. All my kids are adults. None of them say to me, I can't believe you weren't at that soccer game in 2006. Or you didn't go to the fourth showing of my Peter Pan play in middle school because I was on the road with Moms Demand Action. Do you know what my adult kids say? They say two things. One is, I'm so grateful you had other things to put your time into, not just my homework, in my life. And also, you gave me an example of how I could live as an adult, figuring out what I wanted, what lit me up. So legacy is just living a life that is authentic and true to you without all of the fears and the anxieties that society and we internalize and put on ourselves to live a certain way.
I love that. You also talk about desire, and you spoke a little bit about this in the fire triangle, but why is that such an important thing for women to get in touch with?
I think we get dislocated from our desire. And, even that word is loaded. Like it comes with all these sexual connotations. Like, what is desire? Is a woman desirable? Is she desiring? And to me, it is about being passionate. about pursuing the things that make you feel alive as a person, because it is sort of a virtuous circle. When a woman figures out what she wants and she goes after it, she finds her people and she figures out how to, make these baby steps. And I want to be clear, I don't mean go start an organization like I did. It can be as ordinary as having a tough conversation, going to therapy, asking for a promotion, right? It doesn't have to be these big, lofty things. But when you figure out what it is you want and you go after those things and it inspires this confidence in you, this virtuous circle of wanting to help other women do the same thing and finding your people, like it all becomes this shift in your life that is positive.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of just spoke to this, but there's a big part of the book, which is talking about like taking capitalism out of creativity. Like it is okay to just want something
Mm,
without having to monetize it. But we talk about this on the show a lot. Like in this culture, even having that like thought or that desire can feel like you're a failure. Like, oh, I just do this versus like my thing is if you're an artist, you're an artist. It doesn't matter if you monetize it ever a day in your life. If you do the thing, you are the thing. How do you think about it in your own life? Because you have been so successful and you are, a high achiever by all standards. Like how do you just sometimes enjoy things just to enjoy them without feeling like it needs to be more?
This is such a complicated conversation and I love it, but I'll answer that in two ways. The first is, and there's this very funny riff that I quote in the book from Liz Gilbert, who was being interviewed by Kate Bowler, and she talks about purpose and how we're all sold, almost like self-care has become commodified, right? Like
Yeah.
we're sold this idea that we have this one purpose and we have to spend money to find that purpose, figure out what it is. And then once we get the purpose, we have to make money at the purpose. And then we have to help other people make money at the purpose. And then we have to spend the rest of our life, propping that purpose up. Like it becomes a business. And to your point, I think that is the wrong way to look at it. We can love something and do something just because we love and do it. And, maybe you are, I want to give the example of a great story that I told about a woman named Carol Frick in the book. She wanted to be a writer and she ended up being a gym teacher because it paid the bills and that's what she did. But after she retired, she really wanted to go back to writing. And she came up with this idea while volunteering at an animal shelter that she would write a book about a couple that falls in love at an animal shelter. And she had to teach herself how to write a book. How do you write dialogue? How do you create chapters? She did all of this after retiring. And then she ended up being a published author in her 70s. And she said, I didn't care if I made money at it. Like I just wanted to do it because it was something that was important to me my entire life. And I wanted to fulfill that desire. So there's that piece of it, right? Then there is the more complicated piece about women and money. I was a full-time volunteer for 11 years. And I talk in the book about how I think I martyred myself a little bit. It comes back to those extinguishers. I was pursuing what I wanted, but I felt like society, and I didn't realize this until later. I wasn't thinking this at the time, but I think my thought process was people will know I'm a good girl if I don't take any money for this work. Yes, I'm taking on a gun lobby. Yes, I'm, high profile and I'm putting myself out there, but I'm doing it for free. And I did that for 11 years. Meanwhile, my mostly male colleagues, were making a whole lot of money. And I don't think that was a great example to set for other women volunteers. And so I talk about this in the book. It's called a passion tax.
Mhm.
So it is important for women to walk that line. Like, yes, you should pursue your passions, whether or not they enrich you, but also you shouldn't do it just because, you should not take money for it because you feel guilty.
Where are you at in your journey with that? And how are you approaching that as you're putting out this book into the world? And like, I know from the publishing industry, like there's a push to sell. And you talk about how this was your childhood love and you're reigniting it and it's so pure. How are you walking the line and balancing that in this creative exploit?
Well, I have a publicist who said, you will never do anything for free again because you are value. You have
Yes.
value. And that doesn't mean I'm getting paid, tens of thousands of dollars for every speaking engagement, but it just means there is some kind of fee involved that shows that, to me at least, that I have value. And that has really changed the way I look at myself. And so that has been interesting journey for me. But the other thing is, I did this activism for 11 years until I stepped back and in 2023. And what I realized is, yes, I love activism and I love organizing, but even more than that, I love summoning the audacity of other women. And so I will always volunteer to help women run for office. I will always, do whatever I can to support them, to get them in office. And promoting this book has been a joy because it all goes to that desire of helping other women summon their audacity.
Yeah. And I love that you're talking about this because for a long time, I have talked about something I like to call soul, SOULCIAL, social justice. And I look at what you're doing with helping other women summon their audacity and go after their desires as part of that. How do you see igniting your own fire and starting to follow that as being activism? Like, how do you see that playing out in the world?
Mm. Well, look, I think given the state of the world, women cannot afford to sit on the sidelines. And I don't just mean activism. I mean, this book is really about your fires and it's not just one fire, right? That would be a purpose. This is about fulfillment. There are going to be many fires in your life, big and small. And hopefully they are political, professional, personal, right? They run the gamut of that. What I realized as I went through Moms Demand Action was that I just get so much fulfillment out of helping other women figure out what it is they want and to go after that. Because again, there are all these obstacles in the way that we have to navigate. And I feel like I have navigated so many of them that I have good advice and thoughts to give. I don't think my activism is over. I don't think my professional life is over. I know my personal life isn't over. I'm 54 years old. There are so many more chapters, so many more fires left in my life. And, I talked to a woman in the book named Sandra Cisneros, who is a very famous poet and author. And she said, I'm in my 70s and I don't feel like I've written my best poem yet. That's
Mm.
still out there. And I love this idea of like, there's still so much left to do.
Yeah, and I do see this as activism. Like, I think if we had a world full of fully lit up people who were doing what they really knew they were meant to do, who were following the fire minute to minute, our world would look pretty different.
Yes.
Okay, I want to go back to what my friend Latoya calls the fear of pissing people off. You talk about it in depth in the book. It's something you've really had to work with and overcome and probably still dance with at times. Can you tell me about your journey to releasing this fear of conflict or pissing people off or not being seen as the good girl? What has that journey been like in your life and where do you stand with it today?
Oh, I mean, the amount of blowback that I received in so many different ways when I started Moms Demand Action. First of all, the minute I put my Facebook page up, I started receiving threats of death and sexual violence. And I can remember very clearly about 2 weeks in calling the local police to say, like, there's this person who keeps driving by my house. Could you just kind of keep an eye on the neighborhood? And he said, well, ma'am, that is what you get when you mess with the Second Amendment. And it was kind of when I realized I was either going to back down or to double down. And that's a decision we all make all the time, right? Am I going to back down or am I going to double down? And I'm very grateful, and in large part because I had all this outpouring of support from women across the country, complete strangers, that I felt like I could double down. But also, in those early weeks and months, I was making cold calls to people because I knew little to nothing about organizing, gun violence, the legislative process, right? I was building the plane as I flew it. And I had so many people tell me, you're not the right person. You could never do this. It already exists. You will never win. All of this, sort of negative feedback that I had to decide, okay, what's feedback and what is information?
Mm.
How do I tell the difference? What is criticism and what is just advice? And so I go through the book, like different exercises. How do you figure out how to endure this, what feels very much like criticism, and how do you use it constructively? I think that's the key. But blowback is just part of the process, and your ability to grow your fire is directly proportional to the amount of blowback you can withstand. You have to remember that all of it is predictable, especially for women, and none of it is personal.
It's so interesting because you literally were dealing with threats to your life and to your physical safety. And I think that, I mean, I struggle with this immensely still. Like, I realize how much fear of pissing people off or wanting to be seen as a good girl is still holding me back today, especially in reading your book. But like, why do you think, even to those of us that are not receiving those kinds of threats, it feels like death to get told you were wrong or you were bad or you should go away? What is that? And like, as somebody who has literally moved through death threats, how did you do it? Like, how do you get to safety inside of yourself when you feel very unsafe from the feedback you're getting?
Mm. And this is, I think, very gendered. And
Mhm.
I talk to a lot of gender experts in the book that this it triggers, as we talked about earlier, these feelings of guilt and shame. So guilt is, I did a bad thing. Shame is I am a bad person. And when people tell us these things, and when we start to push against societal norms, you will get that kind of blowback. It may not be death threats and sexual violence threats from, strangers on the internet, but it may be a person in the pickup line, right? Who can't believe you decided to leave your marriage. You can be all of these different things that feel like we did a bad thing or we are bad people. And there are different ways to process this, which I go through in the book, but the most important thing is that and there's an expert, I think it's Eve Rodsky, who calls it CIYOO, complicit in your own oppression.
Mhm.
So you start to get so afraid of this, or you buy into this, or you believe this, that you act in the way that you have to stay within these parameters. You cannot go outside of them. And that kind of freezes you in this box in your life where you can't get outside of it. And so I do think it goes back to understanding it's not personal, knowing that it's going to happen, finding different ways to get through the messy middle. And frankly, I think a big part of that is just support, right? Finding support from your family, from your friends, figuring out how to ask for help. Um, Therapy is always a great option too, if you can afford a therapist. I talk a lot in the book about journaling. That was really how, after I realized in my late 30s that I was stuck and I couldn't confide in my husband because our marriage was part of the problem. I couldn't afford a therapist. So I did a ton of journaling, and it really began to create a roadmap for me for the life forward. But there are all different ways I describe in the book. How do you take the blowback? First of all, expecting it, right? Knowing it's coming. And then how do you digest it and not take it personally, not internalize it, not let it make you turn back, right? Whether you're going to double down or back down, and continuing to move forward with those people in your life. And maybe we're going to talk about this, but it's also this idea of a controlled burn, which
Yeah.
is how do you audit the things in your life that are supportive to you and help to you and those that aren't?
Yeah, let's talk about the controlled burn. I love this part. So, can you describe what that is and how you kind of discovered this way of figuring out what fits and what doesn't fit into your life and your fire?
Yeah. Some of this sounds intuitive, but if you're not doing it in practice, it's not gonna help you. Like, if you
Mhm.
just have it in your brain, but if you're actually doing these exercises and writing in your journal, putting it on paper and saying out loud and having, others hold you accountable, then it probably, it's gonna make it more difficult to come to fruition. So, in nature, prescribed burns that we all know, especially if you live in California, they do these burns to prevent wildfires, to prevent out of control fires. And so if you are burned out, if you are having a hard time and with a blowback, if you are really struggling to figure out how to make time to pursue the things that you want, you do a control burn. And it's really an audit and also boundary setting.
Mhm.
So what are the things that are draining my energy? What are the things that are building my energy? And I interview so many different women in the book who've had to do control burns, some of family members who are, toxic is sort of a pejorative word, but it's this idea of who are people that have really my entire life rooted against me and are holding me back. And for some people, that was a family member. For others, I talked to a woman who found that during the pandemic, she stopped feeling alive in her life, and thought it was she was doing two things. She was doom scrolling and she was drinking a lot. And so she did this controlled burn where she cut back on those things and built in more time to do things that filled her up instead of depleted her. And I had a really interesting conversation with a woman. Her name is Milk. She's a pretty famous singing artist. And she thought she got what she wanted. She wrote this amazing song for the Women's March. It went viral. She got a record label. Like, she was doing all the things that she thought were going to make her fulfilled. And yet she never felt more lonely, more unwell. And so she did the same controlled burn. And what she did was she got rid of that record label. She was struggling with an eating disorder. So she went into her closet even and got rid of all the clothes that were constricting her.
Hmm.
And she just kind of like went through the list of what is holding me back and how do I undo those things so that I can move forward. And so there's so many exercises in the book about how you can do your own personal control burn.
Yeah. And how do you know? Because you did talk about how, even leading up to stepping down from Moms Demand Action, you, for many years, were like kind of making these lists and trying to figure out, okay, is it time? Is it not time? How do you know whether you're just like burnt out and you need a rest or if the fire is actually out and it's time to move on?
So this goes back to your life should be full of large and small fires. When I started Moms Demand Action, there were a bunch of strangers, particularly in Silicon Valley, who were helping me. And I was on the phone with them one day. And at the end of the call, one of them randomly said, well, whatever you do, don't get founder syndrome. And I said, oh, of course not. And then I had to Google that because I
Yeah.
had no idea what it meant.
Like never.
And, and it's this idea that when someone starts something, their ego becomes so intertwined with it that when they leave, they either burn it all down because they can't stand for it to exist without them, or it fails because it just can't exist without them. And I knew that I did not want that to happen with Moms Demand Action. I didn't want it to be about me or my ego. I wanted it to be about the cause. And so I made it a practice, this idea again of a practice, a discipline, to ask myself every year at the beginning of the year, is this the time for me to step back? Realizing that power should not be finite or should not be infinite. It should be finite. I wish more people in Congress and companies knew that, but like, what a world it would be if we were all getting ready to hand over the power, right, to somebody
Right.
else eventually. And for those first few years, it was always no, because I just started the organization. Then it started to be maybe, but there would be a horrific tragedy or, there'd be a legislative priority and I would stay on. And then finally in 2022, when we passed the first federal gun safety legislation in a generation, I was standing in the Rose Garden as President Biden signed it into law. And I just knew intuitively, it was like I heard a voice inside me that said, this is it for you. This is the bookend to your activism. And I did hand the reins over to someone else, and that brought new energy and new ideas into the organization. And look, I don't want to pretend that I didn't struggle. I knew that it was going to be really hard to separate the identity I had had for 11 years from the organization I had created. But I think because I was journaling, I had a family system holding me accountable, I had a therapist who reminded me of all the things that I wanted to do, that I was ready and I was able to get through those painful moments. And I think we should all look at every fire as finite and be thinking about when we end it and when the next one begins. But going back to the idea of a bonfire, the good news is all the people that you meet, all the relationships that you create, all the friendships that you build stay with you indefinitely past that fire.
Yeah. The bonfire friends. Can you talk about what that is and yeah, how do you know if you've got a bonfire friend?
In my mind, and I think, the most important thing is you should have shared values. When Moms Demand Action volunteers came in, even in the reddest of states, working on a somewhat polarizing issue, when they found their people, they realized they had shared values. That was often to protect their families and their communities. And when you create your own fire, you realize that you're meeting people with shared values. And those are the people that will help you get through that fire, get to the next fire. I interview Brooke Baldwin in the book. She wrote this book called Huddle, and she talks about how, it was very painful for her to leave CNN. It was very abrupt. It was in the middle of the pandemic. It was her identity. And yet all the people that she met through that job are still there for her as she's figuring out what comes next. And so I really think that women in friendship is, when I write about women in friendship, it's one of the most important topics, most interesting. People just, they're the most read pieces that I write. And I think it's in part because we've gone through a pandemic, because a lot of what we do is online. And there is a real hunger for community. And here's what's fascinating to me. I've had hundreds of women say to me, I want to, now that I've read your book, create a bonfire where I live. I want to create a community based on the book where I live, where we can come together and talk about our personal, professional, political goals. And so these are actually starting up. And that's fascinating to me. I do think there's a real desire for friendship, particularly in midlife. I found myself, I was so busy with Moms Demand Action that even though I had friendships, I didn't have close friends I could call in the middle of the night if there was an emergency. And so I actually had to work to do that. And I've done that. I probably have 5 people now who I'm really close to, who I met through Moms Demand Action.
Yeah. You know what? It was so interesting as you were saying that because I did close the book. Well, I read it on my iPad, so I turned my iPad off. But I did, finish the book, and I thought I need to start working on my friendships. That's
Mm-hmm.
so interesting because you gave so many good takeaways that I wanted to start working on. But the thing that was going through my mind is I need to prioritize my friendships. Like I've been lucky in life that friendships have always kind of come into my life and been easy. But I think because of that, I haven't focused enough on nurturing them. And I've assumed they'll always be there for me.
They
And
take work.
they take work. It's a relationship like any other relationship. So yeah, you definitely you speak to that in a way that even though I didn't like read and think like friendships are what I need to think about now, it did hit me hardest when I left the book. So that's really interesting. I guess I do want to ask a question about like letting go because I think there's such a difficult thing when it's not that you lose a piece of your identity, but it can kind of feel like that when you step away from something that had been a long-term creative project, a part of your day to day. And I know there are people listening right now who are either in the midst of that or know they're about to go through it or maybe never even fully healed from it when they went through it. How did you start to detach yourself and your identity from like, I am the leader of Moms Demand Action to being, I am Shannon?
Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, even now, right? There are times when someone says, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Am I the founder of Moms Demand Action? That doesn't feel real to me anymore. Am I an author? That seems like I'm still sort of not sure. If you ask me, who are you and what do you do?" And so I feel like there are still times I'm in that messy middle. But I think what was the most important to me was the preparation. So as I said, I've made it a discipline to ask myself annually. I created a plan for leaving, but I think what helped me the most was that I gave myself a grace period of a year to leave.
Mm.
So I told my team at the end of 22, and I spent the entire next year saying goodbye to volunteers, telling people publicly, um, thinking about, how I was going to hand the baton over to the next person. And I'll be honest with you, I thought, okay, I'm going to take a real long break after this. I've worked every day for 7 days a week for the last 11 years, and I need to really just sort of reconnect with myself and figure out what's next. As my husband always uses the phrase, let the game come to you.
Mm.
And it wasn't long after I announced publicly that I was leaving that I was running on the treadmill. I looked down at my phone. It's Maria Shriver calling me. I don't know Maria Shriver.
Love Maria.
She's amazing,
Yeah.
right? And so, of course, I stopped the treadmill and got off. And she said, I have a book in print and I want you to write a book for me. And I said, okay, well, what would you want me to write about? And she said, whatever you've learned about women.
Mm.
And I just thought, when will I have this opportunity again? And I never imagined that that was going to be what happened next. So I do think it's this idea of, after there is a fire, the first thing that appears is something called fireweed. It's this beautiful wildflower that can withstand fire. And it is the first thing to grow, and it clears the way for other things to grow. And to me, that is just so emblematic of knowing that there is more out there. There's more to do, and that you can use everything that you've learned in this next role, whatever that is.
So would you say writing and empowering women is your fireweed?
I really do think it's this idea of summoning the audacity of other women that will always be there in me. It has been there my whole life. When I was growing up in Rochester, New York, a place where there were all these suffragists and civil rights activists, and we would go to their homes for field trips or where they spoke. And I was just taught to emulate, to see these people as heroes. And so I think that's always been inside me, even through all the, even when I was working in public relations, and even when I was going through a horrible divorce and all of these different things, that was always sort of the thing, the North Star inside me.
You know, you talk a little bit about this, but I really believe creativity and spirituality are deeply interconnected and kind of, in my opinion, they're the same thing. But I know you're a practicing Buddhist, and I'm curious How has that influenced your creativity, the way you share in the world, and just your general way of being?
I was raised by a very devout Catholic. My dad was in the seminary to be a priest for about 10 years and left when he was 23. And so I was really sort of inculcated into this Catholic culture, and it just never felt right for me. That is not to diss Catholics at all. It's just it didn't feel like home. And I started practicing meditation in my 30s, and that was like a gateway to Buddhism for me. And it felt like, oh, wow, finally a set of tools that are going to help me live my life in a way that is helpful, right? It's like solutions as opposed to like fear and anxiety. And so Buddhism has been such a great fit for me. And this idea of right speech and right action as a leader has been incredibly, incredibly helpful. Like you might see me put some sassy things out into the world online, but you will never see me put things out into the world that are unkind or insulting or mean spirited, because that would not be right speech, right? And I'm not saying I don't make mistakes. I have made many mistakes along the way, but I think Buddhism is also for me a way as to sort of manage my ego. That's everything from, deciding when to step back to making sure that everything wasn't top down. There was also bottom up where you were getting input from other people. And so Buddhism is for me an incredibly important tool. But I also would say you just said something about creativity being the same as spirituality, which I love this idea. What I have found is that when you apply the fire triangle and when it works, because it doesn't always work, it's almost like, trying to light a fire, like it takes
Mhm.
several times to get it going. But when those three things come together, your values, your abilities, and your desires, it is like alchemy. It feels like magic. When I started Moms in Action, it felt like touching the divine.
Mm.
And I think that is creativity.
I totally agree. I think it's seeing the divinity in yourself and others and the connection between all of us. Speaking of that, you spoke about your younger self, and I do believe creativity is deeply and innately connected to the inner child. It brings tears to my eyes to think about that your childhood love is writing, and now you're getting to it and you're living in it and you're showing up as a writer daily. What has it felt like to step into that? And yeah, I just want to start there. What has it felt like to claim that title of writer?
It feels very true to me. It's what I've always loved. So this is another interesting subject because it brings up neurodiversity, which I think is also a discussion that's really happening for women right now in the zeitgeist. I was diagnosed with ADHD in 1984. I was 13 years old. As a girl diagnosed with ADHD in the 1980s, it was bad because, it was mostly considered something that boys had. It wasn't something that was really widely known or diagnosed or treated. But my parents decided not to medicate me because there was still very much a stigma associated with that. I barely made it through middle school. I barely made it through high school. I barely made it through college, right? I graduated over and over again by the skin of my teeth. There was a lot of suffering, a lot of struggling. And I had gone to the University of Missouri to become a journalist. I was obsessed with Woodward and Bernstein. I wanted to be the woman version of that. Watergate was something that just really was fascinating to me. And I couldn't get through the journalism school because I couldn't get through statistics. Thanks to, I have a math learning disability. And so ADHD in many ways has been, it's a little cliche to say it's a superpower, but it is. It's why I could go deep in Moms Demand Action every day, 10 hours a day, even though I wasn't a survivor. It just was so important to me. And so for me to have gotten through all those struggles with ADHD and come out the other side and still have this passion for writing and still be able to do it, albeit in a different way. I spoke at a conference recently and I was asked, what was a common theme that you learned among the 70 women that you interviewed? And I will tell you that over a quarter of them also said they had ADHD and that they struggled, but now they see it in retrospect as something that made them unique and made them successful and made their brains work and think differently. And so for me to have gotten through that and still be able to be a writer, but also to know now with hindsight of, 40 years, that I wasn't stupid, that I wasn't a loser, that I was actually incredibly creative and in many different ways gifted, but it took a lifetime to be able to live the way in an authentic way, right? That isn't just the way the system is set up.
Yeah. If that 13-year-old self was standing in the same room with you today and seeing all the amazing things you've done, this incredible book you've written, your Substack, the communities you've built, what do you think she would say to you today and why?
I think she would say it isn't about the educational system. You don't have to do well in the system. It isn't built for you. You probably can't do well, but that doesn't mean you won't do good.
And what would you say to her?
Oh, I would say keep going. This that you don't have to fit in, that you don't have to do everything perfectly, that it's okay if your grades aren't all A's, and that if you figure out what it is that lights you up and you pursue that, that you will be successful. And I don't mean monetarily, I just mean in your life.
Shannon, you've shared so much amazing insight and so many great ways for people to start their fire. I'm wondering if you have any final words of wisdom for somebody listening who is on the precipice of starting but afraid. What do you think they might need to know?
I think they should ask themselves if they are living their lives from the outside in, meaning what society tells them, or from the inside out. And I am guilty of having spent many decades living outside in instead of inside out. And to really think about all of the things that you've given up on, desires, hopes, dreams, because you think they're unattainable. They're not. And you still have plenty of time. You're not too old to figure it out. And do it in a community of other women. As I said, there are online and offline communities now popping up around the book, and you will find your people and you will find fulfillment.
Yeah. And wait, speaking of which, I was on your Instagram today. You're doing some sort of community with people. Do you want to talk
Yes.
about that?
Yeah, Firestarter University will start in September. There are already something like, I don't know, 400 or 500 women signed up for this. And I just don't think you can figure out how to live on fire on your own. You can go through the book, you can do all the exercises. That's great. You should start to take the baby steps. But when you're in a community of other women, and these women could become your bonfire, right, down the road, it is just easier and it helps you get through that messy middle. So we are going to start in September. It's all online. It's going to last for a year. When you pre-order the book, you get admitted for free. And I'm just really, really excited, not just to teach, but to learn from all these amazing women who are going to show up.
Yeah. It sounds amazing. So is it going to be a weekly thing? Like, what does the container actually look like?
It's once a month,
Once a
and we're
month.
going to come together online. But you are, it's a community that lives on Substack, and so all of these people can constantly be in conversation and talking to one another.
Amazing. Okay. Well, you listening, join the fire starters. And Shannon, thank you for everything you've done in the world, you continue to do. And most importantly, thank you for being who you are, because it's the best thing about you.
Well, you're a fire starter too. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. Thank you for listening, and thanks to my guest, Shannon Watts. For more info on Shannon, follow her at Shannon R. Watts and find her book, Fired Up, at firedupbook.com or wherever good books are found. Unleash Your Inner Creative is hosted and executive produced by me, Lauren LaGrasso. Edited by Blondell Garcon. With theme music by Liz Foll. Again, thank you, my sweet creative cutie. If you like what you heard today, remember to rate, review, and follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Share the show with a friend and post about it on social media. Tag me at Lauren LaGrasso and at Unleash Your Inner Creative, and I will repost to share my gratitude. Also, tag Shannon Watts at Shannon R. Watts so she can share as well. My wish for you this week is that you take one step to start and kindle your fire. Use one of the techniques Shannon mentioned on the podcast. Let's all do this together and compare our notes. I love you, and I believe in you. Talk with you next week.